Chicago's most exclusive restaurant. A woman in emerald silk finally feels beautiful. Then her date leans across the candlelight and says 7 words that stop the entire room cold. "You're too much woman for me." But before the humiliation can swallow her whole, a stranger steps from the shadows, tall, scarred, carrying the kind of silence that makes armed men lower their weapons. He doesn't just defend her, he dismantles the man who hurt her with 4 words and a look that promises worse. What Talia Mercer doesn't know yet, the stranger who just saved her is the most feared mafia boss in Chicago, and her life will never be the same. Watch until the end. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation had been made 3 weeks in advance. Table 14, corner position, Lakeview. The kind of table that costs more to reserve than most people spent on groceries in a month, and Talia Mercer had not been the one to request it. That detail should have told her something. It should have been the first flag, the small wrongness in the architecture of the evening that a smarter, less hopeful version of herself might have caught and examined carefully before walking through those glass doors. But hope was a difficult thing to argue with when you were 34 years old and had spent the last 2 years rebuilding yourself from the inside out. She checked her reflection one last time in the dark glass of the restaurant's entrance. The woman looking back at her was not the woman she had been at 32. Hollowed out by a relationship that had treated her like a problem to be managed, her confidence worn down to something thin and apologetic. That woman had learned to make herself small at dinner tables, to order salads she didn't want, to laugh quietly so as not to draw attention to her own presence. Tonight's woman wore emerald silk. Tonight's woman had spent 40 minutes on her hair and felt no guilt about it. Tonight's woman had decided, somewhere between the taxi ride and the front steps of Aurelius, that she was done with small, done with apologetic, done with the particular brand of self-erasure that polite society handed to women who looked like her and called it grace. She pushed through the door. The interior of Aurelius hit her the way it always hit first-time visitors, like a physical force, an atmosphere of curated beauty so deliberate it almost felt aggressive. Chandeliers dripped amber light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The air carried cedar and expensive candle wax, and the low murmur of conversations that never quite rose above a certain frequency, as though volume itself had been regulated by the same team that selected the stemware. Every surface in the room communicated one thing with ruthless efficiency: you are either someone here or you are not. Talia had spent the last 6 years restoring paintings in spaces not unlike this one, the private collections of Chicago's wealthiest families, their estate galleries and climate-controlled vaults, rooms where the art cost more than most buildings. She knew how to move through spaces like this without looking like she was trying. She'd learned that particular skill the hard way, the way most things worth knowing were learned. The maitre d' found her name without being asked and led her toward the corner. Ethan was already there. She'd known Ethan Cross for 11 days. They had met through a mutual colleague at an authentication event, the kind of professional mixer that existed mainly to let people in adjacent industries pretend they had social lives. He was tall, conventionally handsome in the way of men who had been handsome their whole lives, and had stopped doing anything interesting with it. Corporate finance, he'd said, mergers and acquisitions. He spoke about money the way some people spoke about art, with a reverence that suggested he'd confused its accumulation for meaning. But he had asked good questions. He'd listened when she talked about her work. On their second conversation, he'd remembered the name of the painting she'd mentioned. Vittoria, 1887, oil on canvas, belonged to the De Luca estate, and had asked a follow-up that demonstrated he'd actually thought about it in the intervening days. That had mattered to her, more than it probably should have. He stood when he saw her approach, smiled. There was something rehearsed in it that she chose not to examine. "Talia." He pulled out her chair. "You look—" A fractional pause, the kind most people wouldn't notice. "Great." She sat, smoothed the silk across her lap. "Thank you for the reservation. This place is something. I have a relationship with the owner." He settled back into his seat and lifted his menu with the practiced ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to check a price. Seemed like the right choice for tonight. The sommelier arrived before they'd exchanged another sentence. Ethan ordered a bottle without consulting her, which she noted but filed away under minor. The water came, The bread came. The ambient noise of the room wrapped around them like a curtain, and Talia let herself settle into the evening with the cautious, deliberate optimism of someone who had learned that optimism required effort to sustain. They talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. Her current project, a water-damaged impressionist canvas she was coaxing back to life in her studio on Wabash. His recent deal, a merger he described in terms that made it sound like warfare with better suits. She found herself laughing at something he said about his assistant, and the laugh was real, and for a stretch of perhaps 8 minutes, she allowed herself the quiet pleasure of believing the evening might actually be what it appeared to be. Then the wine arrived, then the first course, and somewhere between the second glass and the arrival of the amuse-bouche, something shifted in Ethan Cross's face. It was subtle at first, a slight withdrawal behind his eyes, as though he were reassessing something. His gaze moved across her in a way that made her think of appraisal. Not the admiring kind, but the clinical kind, the kind used in insurance adjustments and property disputes. She kept talking, kept the surface of the conversation moving, but somewhere below her sternum, a cold space opened that had not been there before. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She set down her fork. "Sure. How do you feel about—" He gestured vaguely in her direction. "All this?" The cold space widened. "I'm not sure what you mean." He had the decency to look briefly uncomfortable before he didn't. "Your size, your— Look, I just mean you carry it confidently. I respect that. But I'm wondering if it's something you're working on, or if this is," another gesture, "where you're landing permanently." The table between them seemed to lengthen. Talia heard her own breathing, felt the silk against her ribs, felt the specific weight of 34 years of being looked at this particular way. Assessed, measured, found to be some inconvenient quantity that people couldn't quite decide whether to apologize for or ignore. "I'm not landing anywhere," she said, and her voice was remarkably steady. "This is just what I look like." Ethan nodded slowly, as though she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "Right, yeah, Look, I'm being honest because I think you deserve honesty. I've been in situations before where the chemistry was there, but the physical compatibility was a challenge. And I don't want either of us to waste time if what?" The pause he took was worse than anything that followed. "You're a lot of woman, Talia." She heard it land, felt it the way she felt things that were meant to hurt. Not immediately, not as pain, but as a rearrangement. Something inside her reorganized around the sentence, old scar tissue pulling tight over new wound. "I'm going to stop you there," she said. But Ethan Cross, who had not once in his adult life been stopped anywhere by anyone, had apparently decided that honesty, his particular brand of it, the kind that dressed cruelty and consideration, was the gift he was offering tonight. "I don't mean it as an insult. I'm genuinely attracted to you. Your face, your mind, the way you talk about your work. That's all real. But physically, I need to be honest. There's a calibration issue. And I think before this goes further, we should—" "Ethan, acknowledge that because I've been in relationships where we didn't address the elephant in the room. Something in the phrasing of that, its particular thoughtless cruelty, hit a register that bypassed her composure entirely. "Stop talking," she said. Not loudly. The table beside them didn't turn, but her voice had dropped to something that she barely recognized, something that came from a place she didn't visit often, because what lived there was not polite and was not patient and had never learned to be small. Ethan stopped, not because of her tone. She realized that immediately. His face had gone still in a different way, not chastened, but interrupted. His eyes moved to a point somewhere behind her left shoulder, and in them she saw something she had not expected. Fear. Talia turned. The man was already there. She had not heard him approach. No one seemed to have heard him approach. He stood approximately 2 feet behind her chair, tall, wide-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that had been cut for his exact dimensions and no one else's. His hair was dark and worn short. His jaw carried a scar that ran from the edge of his cheekbone to the corner of his mouth, pale and settled, the kind of scar that had been there long enough to become simply part of his face. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that caught the chandelier light and did nothing useful with it. He was looking at Ethan Cross with the particular quality of stillness that Talia associated with things that were extremely dangerous in the moments before they became extremely dangerous. "I couldn't help but overhear," the man said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never learned to compete with background noise because background noise had always chosen, apparently, to stop being background noise when he spoke. The entire restaurant had gone fractionally quieter. Not silent, the ambient murmur persisted. But something in the room's attention had shifted. Waitstaff had slowed. Conversations at neighboring tables had dipped in volume. The room had noticed something and was doing the careful human thing of pretending it hadn't. "This is a private dinner," Ethan said. His voice had developed a slight quality of thinness that hadn't been there before. "It was," the man agreed pleasantly. "I don't know who you are, but yes, you do." The silence after those 3 words was the most complete silence Talia had ever experienced in a public place. She watched Ethan Cross, who had navigated mergers worth 9 figures, who had reduced subordinates to silence across boardroom tables, who had just spent 6 minutes dismantling her self-worth with clinical efficiency. She watched Ethan Cross go the specific color of a man who has looked into a corner and found something in it that he cannot talk his way out of. The man in the charcoal suit pulled out the empty chair beside Talia and sat down, not across from Ethan, beside her, as though he'd been expected. "You were saying," he said to Ethan, "something about calibration." Ethan said nothing. "I thought so." The man picked up Talia's wine glass, not his own, hers, examined it for a moment, then set it back down carefully on the table. A deliberate intimacy that was nothing of the sort. It was a statement. "I've been trying to understand what kind of man sits across from a woman like this, in a room like this, and decides that the correct use of his time is to make her feel less than what she is. Look, this is between me and no. Just the one word. Final in the way of doors that lock from the outside." Ethan's jaw worked. He was calculating something behind his eyes. Social cost, physical risk, the available options for a man who had just found himself outmaneuvered in territory he'd thought he controlled. Talia watched it happen with a strange, dissociated clarity, as though she were observing all of this from a point slightly above the table. "I think you should leave," Ethan said, and the effort the sentence cost him was audible. The man smiled. It did not reach his eyes. It did not come anywhere near his eyes. "I think you should have your people call my people tomorrow morning to discuss the outstanding matter of the $300,000 you owe to interests associated with me. And I think in the meantime you should get up, settle tonight's bill, the full bill, including whatever she orders after you leave, and go find somewhere quiet to think very carefully about the difference between the man you've been performing all evening and the man you actually are." Every cell in Ethan Cross's body wanted to push back. She could see it, the whole mechanism of his pride straining against what was happening to it. And then she saw it collapse. Quickly, the way things collapse when the structure holding them was always load-bearing in the wrong direction. He stood. He did not look at Talia. He adjusted his jacket, picked up his phone from the table with hands that were not entirely steady, and walked out of the restaurant without another word. The room exhaled. The man beside Talia did not watch Ethan leave. He was looking at the table, at the half-eaten breadbasket, at the specific middle distance of someone allowing a moment to settle before moving into the next one. "I didn't need that," Talia said. "I know. I was handling it." "Yes." "Then why?" "Because he wasn't going to stop." He said it without apology, without drama, as though it were simply a fact he had assessed and acted on. Men like that, they need an audience, and when they have one, they keep performing. You could have walked out and he would have said something on your way to the door, something that followed you. She stared at him. "I didn't want that to happen," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of performance in it, was the first thing that cracked something open in her chest. "Who are you?" He turned then and looked at her directly for the first time. Up close, the gray-green eyes were sharper than she'd expected. There was intelligence in them, of a variety that had nothing to do with formal education, the kind that came from watching people under pressure for a very long time. "My name is Valentino De Luca," he said. It took her a beat, then another. The name arrived in the back of her memory the way names sometimes did when you'd encountered them in professional contexts, sideways, attached to something else, something prior. De Luca, she said slowly. The estate on the North Shore. Yes. Your mother's collection. She looked at him differently now, recalibrating. The portrait, Vittoria. I spent 4 months on that painting. Something moved across his face. Brief. I know. You know. I watched you work, he said. Twice. You didn't see me. The strangeness of that should have alarmed her more than it did. She would examine that later. Why the admission landed as it did, weighted differently than it should have. But there was something in the directness of it, the absence of pretense, that short-circuited the response she would normally have had to learning she'd been observed without her knowledge. That's a little unusual. Yes. He didn't elaborate. Are you hungry? She blinked. What? The man who just left ordered an appetizer and a wine pairing. His bill is still open. It seems wasteful not to continue. Despite everything, despite the surreal pivot of the last 12 minutes, despite the residue of Ethan's cruelty still sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't passed yet, despite the mounting strangeness of the man beside her and the particular quality of stillness he carried around him like weather, she almost laughed. You want to have dinner, she said. I'm already here. She looked at him for a long moment, looked at the restaurant around them, the chandeliers, the marble, the low murmur of conversation slowly regaining their previous volume as the room decided the interesting thing had passed. She thought about the taxi she could call. The studio waiting on Wabash with its unfinished canvas and its familiar dark and its absolute absence of anyone who might look at her the way Valentino De Luca was looking at her, which was, she realized, as though she were the most interesting object in the room, and he had decided some time ago to be patient about it. Fine, she said. He signaled the waiter. They ate. Not in the way she'd eaten with Ethan, that performance of mutual assessment dressed as conversation. They ate the way people ate when they'd stopped pretending the meal was anything other than what it was, food and time, and the accumulation of sentences between two people who were figuring out what the other one was. He asked about her work with a specificity that told her he already knew the answers to several of his questions and was asking anyway to hear how she framed things. She noticed this and decided to be direct about it. You already know what solvents I use on water-damaged canvas, she said, somewhere between the entree and the dessert. She hadn't planned to order, but had been talked into by the waiter's description of a pear tart tatin that sounded like something she'd regret not eating. Some of them, Valentino said. You've done research. I've done due diligence. He said it the way he said most things, without apology, without the social lubrication people usually applied to admissions like this to make them easier to receive. I prefer to understand the things that matter to me. And I matter to you. Yes. She set down her fork, looked at him. We've been in the same room for approximately 90 minutes. 41 minutes of that was before I came to your table, he said, when I was deciding whether to come to your table at all. What decided you? He was quiet for a moment. A real silence, the kind that contained thought rather than performance. What he said about you not taking up space, Valentino said finally, and the fact that you were already sitting straight when he said it. She didn't have an answer for that. She didn't particularly want to find one. The bill came and went without her seeing it. Outside on Michigan Avenue, the city was doing what Chicago did in October, turning its wind loose in ways that made people walk faster and hold their coats tighter and feel, obscurely, that the season had declared something they hadn't been consulted about. His car was at the curb. Long, black, the kind of vehicle whose tinted windows communicated that whoever was inside had decided privacy was a matter of security rather than preference. A man in a dark jacket stood beside the rear door, and she registered without entirely processing it that he was scanning the street with the focused, systematic attention of someone professionally trained to scan streets. I'll get a cab, she said. I'd prefer you didn't. She stopped, looked at him. Why? Something changed in his face. Not dramatically. A small shift, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves across the sun. Same scene, different quality of light. Because the man who left tonight wasn't acting alone, he said, and the people who sent him aren't finished. The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with October. What does that mean? It means the dinner wasn't coincidental. He held her gaze, and she understood, in the particular way you understood things that your mind was trying to reject, that he was not speaking hyperbolically. He was not managing her. He was telling her something true and terrible with the minimum possible drama because he had found, presumably, that truth delivered plainly was more survivable than truth delivered with theater. Ethan Cross was introduced to you deliberately. The reservation tonight was arranged by people who wanted you in a specific place at a specific time. The restaurant, the corner table, the lake view. Why? She heard herself ask. Because of me, he said. And then, get in the car, Talia. I'll explain what I can. She stood on Michigan Avenue with the wind pressing the silk of her dress against her legs, and the city roaring past in its indifferent way, all headlights and horns, and the distant percussion of a Chicago autumn. She thought about the cab. She thought about her studio. She thought about the canvas on Wabash, half restored, the damaged sections still holding their secrets. She thought about the way Valentino De Luca had said because of me, not as a confession, not as a boast, but as a simple and terrible statement of causality. She got in the car. The door closed behind her with the heavy, particular finality of armored vehicles. The sound of the outside world being replaced by a controlled interior, temperature regulated and insulated from the noise of the city in ways that ordinary cars were not. The leather was dark. The privacy partition was up. She and Valentino sat in the back with the length of a seat between them, the city sliding past the tinted windows in impressionistic streaks of light. Tell me, she said. He told her. The De Luca name was one she'd associated with art collecting and old money and the particular civic philanthropy that wealthy families deployed in Chicago to translate their wealth into legitimacy. The estate on the North Shore. The foundation. His mother, Elena De Luca, who had collected impressionists with the focused obsession of a woman who had decided that beauty was the only thing worth accumulating and had spent 40 years making her case. She had known the name. She had not known what the name meant in the circles below the visible surface of Chicago's economy. Valentino told her in the spare, unsentimental terms of someone reciting facts they had long since processed past the point of feeling. The De Luca organization, the territories, the network of relationships, some financial, some coercive, most some compound of both, that constituted what he was and what he ran. He told her the way a doctor told a patient their diagnosis, completely, without unnecessary softening, with a particular kind of respect embedded in the directness of it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the car had moved north along the lakefront, the water dark and wide to their right. And Ethan, she said, was in debt to the Marchetti family. He said the name the way you said the name of a weather system, with a neutral respect for its capacity for damage. They offered him an exit in exchange for facilitating access. Access to me? Yes. Why me? He was quiet for a moment that she had learned in the last few hours was different from his other silences. More internal, less tactical. Because 6 months ago, my intelligence indicated that the Marchetti organization had identified you as a potential leverage point, someone associated with me, known to me, who could be used as pressure or as bait. He paused. I should have contacted you sooner. I chose to observe instead, because contact would have confirmed to them that you mattered. And tonight changed that calculation. Tonight they moved first. He looked out the window. Which means my waiting was wrong. I made a decision based on one set of risks and missed another. I'm telling you that because you should know. The admission sat between them oddly. She hadn't expected it. The undefended acknowledgement of a miscalculation from a man who seemed, in every other observable respect, to be someone who had constructed his entire existence around not being wrong. Where are we going? She asked. My estate. He turned back from the window. Tonight it's the safest place available to you. After that, I'll have options for you. Safe houses, private transport out of the city, if you want it. You're not a prisoner. I want to be clear about that. You have choices, but I need you to understand what each choice costs before you make it. She thought about her apartment, the studio on Wabash, the neighborhood she'd lived in for 6 years, the coffee shop on the corner, the particular way afternoon light came through her north-facing windows in October and hit the easel at an angle that made even damaged things look briefly whole. She thought about Ethan Cross's face when Valentino had arrived at the table. The specific species of fear in it, not the ordinary fear of social consequence, but something more fundamental. The fear of a man who had been found by something that did not observe the rules of the environment he thought he was operating in. "You said you watched me work," she said. "Yes." "At your mother's estate." "Yes." "The Vittoria painting." She held his gaze. "Your mother's name." Something moved across his face again, the same brief thing she'd caught before, the controlled passage of something uncontrolled beneath a carefully maintained surface. "She died 4 years ago," he said. The painting was her most prized possession. She said it was the only portrait she'd ever seen that had managed to paint a woman looking out of the canvas rather than into it. Talia had spent 4 months with that painting. She knew exactly what Elena De Luca meant. "The woman in the portrait," she said carefully. "She was looking at something outside the frame." "At whoever had hurt her," Valentino said. "According to my mother, she said you could see it in the way she held her hands." A pause. "When I watched you work on it, I thought you understood that about it. The way you treated the damage, the patients." Talia was quiet. The car moved north. The city thinned around them. The lake remained vast and lightless and constant, running parallel to their direction with the disinterest of things that had existed for much longer than anything they were adjacent to. And then the car stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way vehicles stopped when their drivers received information through earpieces that changed their understanding of the situation in front of them. Valentino was already moving, already turning toward the partition, already pressing something she hadn't noticed on the door panel. The partition came down. His driver, visible now, had his phone to his ear and his eyes on the road ahead, where, she saw, there was nothing visible but dark asphalt and the distant red pulse of what might have been taillights. Valentino said something she didn't catch, short, in a register that was not meant for her. The driver responded with a single word. Valentino's jaw set. He turned to her. "Stay low," said it quietly, without ceremony. In the tone of a man issuing an instruction he expected to be followed immediately and without discussion. "What's happening?" The first shot hit the rear passenger panel with a sound like a hammer striking a bell. A deep, ringing percussion that she felt in her sternum before she processed it as sound. Then another. Then a third from a different angle, which told her without being told that there was more than one vehicle, more than one point of origin, that whatever was happening outside the armored glass was organized rather than opportunistic. Valentino's hand found her shoulder and pressed her down. She went, flattening herself across the seat, the silk of her dress twisted around her knees, the cold leather against her cheek, the sounds outside becoming a sequence she couldn't parse. Engine sounds, impacts, voices she couldn't hear, motion. Valentino was not crouching. She could see him sitting upright, phone at his ear, speaking in low, quick sentences while the car accelerated. His face was calm in a way that was not the calm of a man who was not afraid. She understood the difference now, viscerally, in a way she hadn't 90 minutes ago. But the calm of a man for whom fear was a condition he had made his peace with long enough ago that it no longer interfered with function. The shooting lasted perhaps 45 seconds. It felt much longer. When it stopped, the silence was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "Clear," the driver said. Just the word. Flat. Valentino looked down at her. "You're all right?" She pushed herself up. Her hands were not steady. She pressed them flat against her thighs and refused to let them shake in any visible way, which was not composure exactly, but was the closest she could manage. "Fine," she said, and her voice was steadier than her hands. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately catalog. Not admiration, not pity, but something that held both and was neither. "Good," he said simply. The car drove on. Behind them, somewhere on the dark lakefront road, whatever had happened was already becoming past tense. The city pressed close around them and then fell away again as they moved north, and Talia sat in the dark of the armored car and looked at the man beside her, who was already on another call, already dealing with the aftermath of the last 5 minutes. The way you dealt with something you had planned for. And understood, with the full weight of her intelligence applied to the situation, that nothing about her life after tonight would resemble the life she'd woken up to this morning. She thought about the canvas on Wabash, the damaged sections, The patient work of restoration, the way you approached ruined things, not by trying to return them to what they had been, but by understanding what they were now, with the damage incorporated, and working carefully within that reality. The estate gates appeared ahead of them, iron, tall, set in stone walls that disappeared into the dark tree line on either side. Security lights, cameras, the particular fortified stillness of a place that had been built with its own defense in mind. She had stepped through the door of Aurelius tonight feeling, for the first time in a long time, like herself. She had no idea, sitting in the back of an armored car with bullets still ringing in the panel beside her head, that the self she'd walked in wearing was already becoming insufficient for what came next. The gates opened, the car rolled through, and somewhere behind the stone walls and the dark trees and the lake wind pressing against everything, Talia Mercer felt the last of the evening she had planned for disappear, replaced by something that had no name yet, something enormous and uncharted, something that was going to require every version of her strength she had ever developed and several she had not yet discovered. The gates closed behind them. The estate was larger than she'd expected and quieter than it had any right to be. Past the gates, the driveway curved through a corridor of old oak trees that blocked the lake wind entirely, creating a pocket of stillness that felt engineered rather than natural. The main house materialized out of the dark incrementally. First the lit windows, warm and amber against the October black, then the stone facade, then the full scope of it, which was considerable without being ostentatious. Someone had built this place to last rather than to impress, which told her something about the generation that had built it, and something different about the man who had inherited it. The car stopped at the front entrance. Valentino was out before the driver cut the engine, moving around to her side with a purposefulness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he occupied space, not performing urgency, just operating at a frequency slightly faster than the people around him. She got out without waiting for the door to be opened for her. He noticed, didn't comment. Inside, the house resolved into rooms she hadn't anticipated. Not the cold grandeur of a man who had decorated with money and nothing else. There were books that had been read. A hallway where the rugs were worn in the specific places people wore rugs when they actually walked on them. A side table near the entrance with a coffee mug that had been set down and not yet collected. The house had been lived in. That mattered, though she couldn't immediately articulate why. A woman appeared from the back corridor, 50s, compact, wearing the expression of someone who had been woken and had decided not to make anything of it. She looked at Talia with a brief, comprehensive assessment, and then at Valentino with something that was not quite reproach and was not quite concern, but occupied the territory between them. "Mrs. Carver," Valentino said, "will need the east guest room and coffee." "It's past midnight," Mrs. Carver said. "Yes." She looked at him for another moment, then at Talia, then turned and went without further comment. Her footsteps were quiet and unhurried. A woman who had learned, Talia gathered, that urgency in this house was best left to the people it belonged to. Valentino led her through the main hall and into what turned out to be a study. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fireplace that was not lit, 2 chairs angled toward each other across a low table. He didn't sit. He moved to the window that looked out across the back lawn toward the black line of the lake and stood there with his hands loose at his sides, looking at something or at nothing, while Talia lowered herself into one of the chairs and let the reality of the last 2 hours begin its full descent. Her hands were still unsteady. She pressed them flat on her thighs again and breathed. "The men tonight," she said. "Were they Marchetti?" "Yes." He didn't turn from the window. "How many?" 3 vehicles, 8 men." A pause. 4 of them won't be going back." She absorbed that. "And the other 4? Gone." He said it flatly. Not with satisfaction, not with regret, with the same neutral quality he applied to most facts, as though his emotional relationship with events had been routed through a system that processed them into information rather than feeling. "They'll report back, which means the Marchetti family knows tonight's operation failed and will be reassessing." How long before they reassess into something else? He turned from the window then, looked at her directly, and she saw in it the things she'd been picking up all evening in pieces. The quality of a man who did not often find himself uncertain and did not enjoy the experience of it. 48 hours, he said. Maybe less. Mrs. Carver returned with coffee on a tray. She set it on the low table between the chairs, looked at neither of them specifically, and left again. The coffee was real, dark, thick, the kind that made no concessions to preference. Talia poured a cup and wrapped both hands around it and let the heat do what heat did when your nervous system was running at frequencies it wasn't designed to sustain. "You said I have choices," she said. "Yes. Walk me through them." "Actually, walk me through them. Not the version where you tell me what's safe. The real version." He came away from the window and sat down in the second chair. Not leaning back, forward, elbows on his knees, which was the first time she'd seen him occupy space at less than his full upright authority, and the effect was oddly more intimidating rather than less. Option 1. I put you in a safe house outside the city tonight. Milwaukee or Indianapolis, somewhere with no DeLuca association. You stay there under protection until this is resolved. How long? Unknown. Option 2. You leave the country. I have arrangements in place. Italy, specifically, a property in Umbria that the Marchetti network has no knowledge of. You'd be completely removed from the situation. Until when? Until I finish it. She looked at him over her coffee cup. And option 3 is staying here. Option 3, he said, is the one I haven't offered you yet, because it's the one that involves the most risk and requires you to trust me in ways you have no established reason to trust me. Tell me anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then, you stay. You're visible, within controlled parameters. We use the fact that they want to find you as a mechanism to draw out the Marchetti operations leadership rather than waiting for them to come at us in a context of their choosing. He held her gaze. It makes you a component of the strategy rather than a protected variable. It means your safety depends on precision planning and on things going correctly, which things do not always do. But it ends faster, if it works. And if it doesn't work, he didn't look away. Then I've failed you in the most significant way it's possible to fail someone. The directness of it hit her in a way she hadn't prepared for. No hedge, no qualification. Just the clean, undecorated statement of what the failure would mean, offered to her without softening because he had apparently decided she was owed that. She drank her coffee. The fire wasn't lit, but the room was warm from some other source, and the house was quiet around them in the way of places that were equipped with many people who knew how to be quiet. I'm not making that decision tonight, she said. That's reasonable. I need to sleep, and tomorrow I need to understand more before I decide anything. Also reasonable. She set down the cup. You watched me work on your mother's painting for, how long did you say? Twice. 2 separate visits to the estate, approximately 4 hours each time. And you didn't introduce yourself? No. Why not? He looked at the table between them, not at her. A brief departure from his characteristic directness that she filed away carefully. Because what I felt watching you work was something I hadn't accounted for. And I don't act on things I haven't accounted for until I understand them. That sounds like something a very controlled person says when they're telling you they were caught off guard. His eyes came back to hers. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it is. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she stood. Show me the east guest room, she said. He showed her. She slept badly and woke early, before the light had fully committed to the day, and lay in the dark of an unfamiliar room, listening to the lake wind in the oaks and feeling, with the particular clarity that came from sleep deprivation and adrenaline hangover, the full strangeness of where she was and how she had gotten here. The east guest room was large and simply furnished. A bed, a writing table, a lamp, curtains that were heavy enough to suggest someone had given thought to both darkness and privacy. Her emerald dress was hanging on the back of the door where she had left it. She'd been given a change of clothes, which had appeared outside her door some time before she'd fallen asleep. Practical things, her size exactly, which told her that either Mrs. Carver was very good at estimating or someone had been paying attention. She got up, found the bathroom, stood under a shower until the hot water ran the last of last night's tension out of the spaces between her shoulder blades. Then she dressed and went to find out what the house looked like in daylight. It looked like a place someone had actually built a life in, which surprised her more by light than it had by dark. The hallways held photographs, not displayed with curatorial intention, but accumulated the way photographs accumulated in homes that had been lived in across generations. She stopped at one. A woman in her 50s, dark-haired, standing in a garden somewhere Mediterranean, laughing at whoever held the camera. The kind of photograph that caught people in the moment before they remembered a camera was present. Elena De Luca. She could see it. The architecture of the features, the particular set of the jaw. She could see, too, something she hadn't expected. The ease. The woman in the photograph was entirely at ease in her body, in the garden, in the moment, not performing comfort, actually comfortable. She hated having her photograph taken. She turned. Valentino was in the hallway behind her, dressed but looking like someone who had either not slept or slept very little, his jacket absent, his collar open, the controlled presentation of last night slightly degraded by the hours. It made him look, unexpectedly, more human, not less dangerous, more human. The garden photographs are the only ones that worked, he said, because the camera was 40 feet away and she was actually paying attention to the tomatoes. She grew tomatoes? Obsessively. He looked at the photograph for a moment. She said it was the only honest thing you could do with good soil. Talia looked at the woman in the photograph one more time, then turned away. Breakfast? She said. They ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, which she got the impression was his default. Mrs. Carver produced eggs and toast and coffee with an efficiency that made conversation unnecessary, and departed with the same quiet authority she applied to everything. They ate across a kitchen table from each other, and the morning moved around them. He told her more. Not about the strategy, not about the Marchetti organization, about the shape of the situation she was standing in. The history of it, the years of territorial dispute that had calcified into something more personal, the specific nature of what the Marchetti family wanted, and why she had become, in the last 6 months, a useful instrument in their planning. He explained it the way he'd explained things the night before, completely, without managing her response. She listened, asked specific questions. He answered them specifically. It was, she thought, the most useful conversation she'd had in years. By mid-morning, she had asked to see the rest of the house, and he had shown her, including the room that stopped her in the doorway and required a moment before she could actually enter it. A studio. South-facing windows, the correct orientation. A work table with the kind of surface she would have specified herself. Shelving, clean and empty. A utility sink in the corner. The smell of primer and potential. This was my mother's, Valentino said from the doorway behind her. She painted, not professionally. She said she painted to understand what the people who painted professionally were actually doing. Talia moved into the room slowly, ran her fingers along the work table's edge. The light through the south windows was exactly right. The even, diffuse quality that conservators and painters both relied on, the kind that showed you things without distorting them. Has anyone used it since she died? No. She turned around. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her in the room the way he'd apparently watched her in other rooms, with the patient, focused attention of someone who had decided this was worth watching. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because you're going to be here for some period of time," he said, "and idle hands are, in my experience, a problem in high-pressure situations, and because," a pause, shorter than his other pauses, "she would have liked you to use it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't actually know that." "No," he agreed, "but I believe it." The morning passed, then the afternoon began, and with it came Gareth Quinn. She heard him before she saw him, a voice in the front hall with a particular quality of projection, the kind of voice that had learned to fill rooms early and had never unlearned it. By the time she came down the main staircase, he was already in the study with Valentino, and the conversation she walked into the edge of was not the comfortable kind. 3 days of exposure while you did nothing, Quinn was saying. He was standing near the fireplace, now lit, the afternoon having turned cold, with the posture of a man making a point with his body as well as his words. Broad, somewhere in his late 40s, wearing a jacket that was slightly too expensive for the rest of his presentation. Salt and pepper at the temples. Eyes that moved to her when she appeared in the doorway with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone who processed people as variables. And now she's in the house. "Gareth," Valentino said. Not a warning exactly. A notation. Quinn looked at her for another half-second, then back at Valentino. "Can we discuss this privately?" "You can say what you need to say." A beat of tension. Then Quinn turned fully toward her, which was a choice, a deliberate one, she realized. The choice to make the conversation happen in front of her rather than around her. Ms. Mercer, Gareth Quinn, I'm the operational second to Mr. DeLuca. He said it with a professional courtesy that was technically impeccable and contained, somewhere in its architecture, a distinct note of something else. I want to be clear that our priority is your safety. What I need to discuss is how that safety is best secured and whether the current arrangement serves that goal. The current arrangement is my decision, Valentino said. The current arrangement creates exposure for the organization that we have not fully assessed. Quinn's voice was even, which she understood was its own form of pressure. The evenness of a man who had practiced this argument and was delivering it with controlled force. Bringing her here, to the primary estate, with the Marchetti operation actively in play, that's a vulnerability we didn't have 48 hours ago. She was already a target. She was a potential target in an external location where the exposure could be managed. She's now a target in our location, which means when they come for her, and they will come, they come here. Valentino said nothing. There are better options, Quinn said. Controlled options. Safe houses with security infrastructure that doesn't require us to treat the primary estate as a combat location. I presented her with options, and she chose this one. She hasn't chosen yet. Valentino's voice had not changed in volume or register, but something in it had a slight dense quality, like a pressure differential. And when she does, it will be her choice. Quinn looked at him steadily for a moment. Then, she's not the only consideration here. I'm aware of that. I'm not sure you are. Quinn took one step toward Valentino, not aggressively, but deliberately, the body language of a man who intended to be heard by closing distance. Because in the 11 years I've worked for this organization, I have never seen you make a tactical decision based on a pause where the word he chose had weight, personal interest. The room went very quiet. Talia stood in the doorway and felt the silence like something physical. Valentino looked at Quinn for a long moment. His face was utterly still. Choose your next sentence carefully, he said. Quinn held his gaze. I'm saying what needs to be said, because someone in this organization has to. He glanced at Talia, brief, pointed, then back to Valentino. She compromises your judgment. That's a fact, not an insult. And compromised judgment in our position costs lives. It has cost lives before. You know the names. Something crossed Valentino's face at that. A flicker of something old and settled, the kind of pain that had been processed down to scar tissue and rarely surfaced, but surfaced now, briefly, against his will. Quinn saw it. She saw Quinn see it. Whatever the names were, they had landed exactly where he'd intended. Get out, Valentino said quietly. Val, get out of this room, Gareth. We'll continue this conversation when I'm prepared to have it. Quinn straightened, adjusted his jacket, looked at Talia one more time with an expression she couldn't fully parse. Not hostile, not warm, but calculating in a way that made the skin at the back of her neck tighten. Then he turned and walked past her through the doorway, his footsteps measured and unhurried all the way down the hall. She came into the room. Valentino was at the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, looking into the flames with the expression of someone performing the manual labor of getting themselves back to a neutral position. He's not wrong, she said. He looked at her. About the tactical reality. He's not wrong. I know he's not wrong, Valentino said. That's not the part that's a problem. She moved to the second chair and sat. What's the part that's a problem? He was quiet for a moment. Then, Gareth has been my second for 11 years. In that time, he has been the person most consistently right about difficult things. I trust his judgment more than almost anyone's. He looked back at the fire, which means when he's wrong in ways that are harder to see and harder to correct. What's he wrong about? Valentino turned from the fire entirely and faced her. He thinks you make me weaker, he said. He's mistaken about the direction of the effect. She held his gaze, said nothing. That's not a comfortable thing to have said out loud, he added, with a dryness that surprised her into something close to a smile despite everything. No, she agreed. I imagine it isn't. Evening came. The lake outside went from gray to dark, and the estate settled into its nighttime rhythms. Security shifts changing, the quiet movement of people doing the work that kept the perimeter intact. Valentino had 3 calls she wasn't present for, and 1 meeting in the study that involved 2 men she hadn't seen before, and lasted 40 minutes. She used the time to go back to the studio. She had nothing to work with. No canvas, no materials, nothing but the room and the south-facing light, which was gone now anyway, replaced by the warm, artificial nothing of evening. She sat at the work table and looked at the empty shelves and thought about the Vittoria painting, about the woman in it looking out of the frame at whatever had hurt her. Valentino had said his mother believed the woman was looking at whoever had hurt her. Looking, not away, not down. She heard the footstep at the studio door and knew without turning that it wasn't Valentino. The quality of the step was different, heavier in a way that tried to be light. She turned. Gareth Quinn stood in the doorway. His jacket was gone now. He was in shirt sleeves, which made him look both more ordinary and, paradoxically, harder. He was holding a glass of something amber, and he was looking at her with the calculating expression she'd caught in the study, but stripped now of its professional surface. The controlled projection was still there, but underneath it she could see something that... The thing underneath Gareth Quinn's professional surface was patience. Not the passive kind, the active kind. The patience of a man who had decided some time ago exactly where he was going and had been moving toward it carefully ever since, one controlled step at a time, and had arrived now at a threshold he'd been building toward without announcing it. He came into the studio the way men came into rooms when they'd decided the room was already theirs. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I wanted to apologize for this afternoon." She didn't stand, kept her hands flat on the work table, and looked at him steadily. "You don't seem like a man who apologizes." "I don't, generally." He moved to the shelving along the left wall, examining the empty brackets the way you examine things when the examination was not really about the thing. "But I was direct in a way that put you in an uncomfortable position. That wasn't my intention." "What was your intention?" He turned and looked at her over the rim of his glass. To make Valentino hear something he needed to hear. He swirled the amber liquid once, whether or not he wanted to. "And you needed me in the room for that." A small pause. The pause of a man who had been caught being precise and was deciding how to wear it. "It was useful," he said. She held his gaze. "What do you want, Mr. Quinn?" He came to the work table and set his glass down on it without asking if that was acceptable. Then he pulled out the stool across from her and sat. And the gesture had a finality to it that made the room feel smaller. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. Large hands, deliberate. The hands of someone who had learned to keep them visible as a trust mechanism. "I want you to understand something about Valentino De Luca," he said. "Something that the version of this situation you're currently operating with doesn't include." "I'm listening." 3 years ago, Quinn said, there was a woman. Her name was Sonia. She was a journalist, investigative, good at her job, the kind of woman who made you feel, when she talked to you, that she was the most intelligent person in the room. He held Talia's gaze. Valentino became involved with her, significantly involved, in ways that affected his judgment in this organization, in ways I flagged repeatedly and was ignored repeatedly. The fire in the study was a floor below. Up here the room was cool, and the south-facing windows were dark rectangles of nothing. The Marchetti organization identified her as a point of leverage, Quinn continued. They made contact with her. And Sonia, who was in the end more afraid of them than she was loyal to Valentino, gave them 6 months of internal organizational intelligence in exchange for her own safety. He let that sit. 4 of our people died because of what she gave them, men with families. One of them had a son who was 8 years old. Talia said nothing. Valentino blamed himself, Quinn said. Which is the correct response. He had compromised the organization's security by allowing a personal attachment to override operational protocol. He knows this. He has lived with it for 3 years. Quinn picked up his glass and held it without drinking from it. "And now you're here." She heard what he was doing, heard the architecture of it, the true story deployed as a weapon, the emotional weight of dead men and an 8-year-old boy placed precisely where it would do the most structural damage. She heard all of it and acknowledged it and still felt the impact of it, because that was how true things worked when they were used skillfully. "I'm not Sonia," she said. "No," Quinn agreed. "You're not. You're a conservator with no intelligence value and no organizational connections and no reason to make a deal with anyone." He set the glass down again. But you don't have to be Sonia to have the same effect. You just have to matter to him, and you do. He said it without cruelty, almost gently. You've been here for less than 24 hours, and you already do. She stood up, not quickly, deliberately, the way she stood when she needed to remind herself that she occupied space and had the right to. I think you should finish your drink somewhere else. Quinn rose without argument, picked up his glass, moved toward the doorway, and then stopped with his back to her, looking out into the hallway, and said the thing he'd come to say. Tomorrow night, Valentino has a meeting at the South Docks. A Marchetti intermediary, supposedly. A channel for negotiation. He paused. I arranged it. The cold started at the base of her spine. What I'm about to tell you, I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth before it happens, he said, still not turning. The meeting is real. The intermediary is real. And the offer that will be on the table is real. A permanent ceasefire, territorial boundaries redrawn. The Marchetti organization standing down completely. He finally turned. His face in the hallway light was calm in a way that had no bottom to it. All they want in exchange is you, delivered, alive, tonight. The room did not move. It felt like it should have, like the floor should have shifted, some physical acknowledgement of what had just been said. But rooms did not move for revelations. They simply held them, indifferent. You arranged the meeting, she said. Yes. You're Valentino's second. Yes. And you made a deal to hand me to his enemies. Quinn's expression did not change. I made a decision to end a war that has cost this organization more than you have been told, with the only currency the other side will accept. He took one step back toward her. Valentino won't make that trade. You know that by now. He won't make it because of what you've become to him in 36 hours, which should terrify you about his state of mind and about what the next 6 months look like if nothing changes. Another step. I will make it, because my job, the job I have done for 11 years, is to protect this organization when its leader cannot protect it from himself. She was calculating distances. The door behind Quinn, the window, the utility sink, the work table between them, the things on the work table's shelving. Nothing yet. The shelves were empty. She'd noted that with professional disappointment only hours ago, and now the note returned with a different weight. When? She said. The car comes at 11. It's 9:47 now. He said it the way you said the time to someone who needed to board a train. I've arranged for the security rotation at the east wing to have a gap at 10:55. The east service entrance will be unlocked. You have it all organized? Yes. And if I don't go? Then the car comes anyway, Quinn said quietly. And people get hurt in ways and quantities that don't need to happen. He looked at her with something that might, in a different kind of man, have been called regret. I'm giving you the chance to make this a choice rather than a seizure. That's a courtesy. I want you to understand that. That's a remarkable thing to call it. Talia. He used her first name for the first time, and the familiarity of it was its own kind of aggression. Go to your room, collect anything you need, be at the east service entrance at 10:55. This ends without further damage. He left. His footsteps went down the hall, unhurried and even, and then the staircase swallowed them, and then the house was quiet. She stood at the work table for 30 seconds, maybe less. The shock of it was there. She could feel it waiting at the periphery. The enormous, destabilizing fact of what had just happened trying to claim the center of her attention. She refused to let it. Shock was a luxury, and she did not have time for luxuries. She moved to the door, listened. The hallway was empty. She went to the top of the main staircase and looked down into the entry hall below. One of Valentino's security staff was crossing from east to west, unhurried, earpiece in, normal patrol rhythm. She went back to the east guest room and closed the door without latching it and stood in the dark with her back against it and thought. Quinn believed she would run. Or he believed she wouldn't and the car would come at 11 anyway, and her running would simply reduce the number of people hurt in what followed. Either way, his architecture assumed one thing, that she had no move that wasn't reactive. That her options were the options he had given her, which was run or be taken, and everything between those 2 points was just the space in which damage occurred. That assumption rested on something, It rested on her being what she had been when she arrived. The woman in the emerald dress, the external variable, the leverage point, the person this was happening to rather than the person inside it. She went to the writing table and found paper. She wrote 6 words, folded the paper once, and then she left the room. Valentino was in the study on the ground floor. She could hear his voice through the partially closed door. One-sided, a call, the low, rapid cadence of a man working through a problem with someone on the other end who was doing the same. She pushed the door open and walked in. He looked up. The call continued for 3 more seconds and then stopped. He lowered the phone. She put the folded paper on the desk in front of him. He looked at it, looked at her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm yet, but its precursor. The sharpening that came before alarm when the information hadn't been received, but the information's quality had been anticipated. He unfolded the paper. The 6 words. Quinn made a deal. Tonight. Docs. She watched him read it, watched the thing that crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly. Something worse than surprise. Something that had the shape of a wound reopening. He put the paper down on the desk very carefully. The carefulness of the gesture was its own kind of tell. He stood. How do you know this? He told me himself. He came to the studio. She kept her voice level. 11 o'clock, there's a car. He wants me at the East Service entrance at 10:55. Valentino looked at her steadily. Behind his eyes, she could see the processing happening. Information being sorted, assessed, cross-referenced against everything else he knew. The whole architecture of his understanding of the last several years being examined for the places where Quinn had been present and influential, and what each of those moments now meant in a different light. What else did he tell you? The voice was very controlled. About Sonia. The muscle in his jaw moved. Once. He used her to make the point, Talia said, that you have a pattern, that you allow personal attachment to override operational judgment and people die for it. He framed himself as the corrective mechanism. Did he? It was not a question. He believes it, she said. That's what makes it dangerous. He's not doing this for money or for the Marchetti family. He's doing it because he has decided it's the right call, and he has 11 years of organizational loyalty as evidence that his judgment is sound. Valentino moved around the desk, not toward the door, toward the window, which was his move, she'd noticed, when he was thinking through something that required physical containment. He stood at the glass and looked out at the dark lawn. He arranged tomorrow's meeting, he said. Yes, the intermediary is real. The offer is real. Ceasefire, territory, everything, in exchange for me. And he thought you would run. Or he thought I wouldn't, and it didn't matter. She paused. He's been planning this for longer than tonight. The detail in it. The security rotation gap, the service entrance, the car. That's not something you arrange in an afternoon. The silence between them had a texture now. The texture of a structure that had revealed a fault line. Not collapsed yet, but the fault was visible, and everything built on top of it was now suspect. How long? Valentino said, more to the window than to her. How long was he working against me? She didn't answer. She didn't have the answer. But she saw him ask it and saw what the asking cost him. 11 years compressed into a single question, the weight of a loyalty he had believed in absolutely being re-examined backward through time. Every decision Quinn had shaped, every piece of counsel he had offered, every moment of his quiet, competent, indispensable presence, now potentially something other than what it had appeared. She understood that kind of re-examination. She'd done it herself after her last relationship had ended, the retroactive audit of every moment, trying to identify where the thing had actually been, what it appeared to be, and where it had been performance. The exhaustion of it, the way it made you distrust your own perception as much as the person who had deceived you. Valentino. She said his name the way you said someone's name when you needed them back in the room. He turned. We have an hour, she said. What do you need to do? For a moment he simply looked at her, and in that look she saw something she recognized because she had been wearing a version of it herself for 36 hours. The expression of a person whose category for another person had been continuously revised upward and had arrived somewhere unexpected. I need to make 3 calls, he said, and I need to know where Quinn is in the house. He was heading down from the studio level 20 minutes ago. He'll be in his office on the second floor. Valentino moved to the desk, picked up his phone, then stopped, looked at her again. You could have run, he said. He gave you the exit. I know. Why didn't you? She looked at him steadily. Because the exit he gave me wasn't an exit, she said. It was a different kind of trap. And because... She paused, and the pause held something she was still working out the full dimensions of. I don't run from things that are trying to reduce me. I stopped doing that. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he made the first call. The next 50 minutes moved at a different speed than regular time, compressed and stretched in alternating intervals, the way time moved when the stakes of each minute were unequal. Valentino made his calls in rapid succession, 2 in the study and 1 walking the main hall, his voice low and precise and utterly stripped of anything that wasn't operational. She stayed in the study and listened to the house around her, the security staff shifting, the subtle change in ambient sound that came when people who knew how to be quiet began moving toward positions with purpose. She was thinking about the studio, about the empty shelves, about what Quinn had said and what he'd left unsaid, and about the particular intelligence of a man who arranged things well enough that by the time you saw the arrangement, you were already inside it. At 10:40, Valentino came back to the study. He sat across from her. His face had settled into something she hadn't seen on it before, a flatness that was not the flatness of composure, but the flatness of a man who had compressed something very large into a very small space and was holding it there by force. Quinn has been in contact with the Marchetti organization for approximately 4 months, he said. Based on what I've been able to reconstruct in the last 40 minutes, he paused. The docs meeting tomorrow was built on intelligence that only 3 people in this organization had access to. A territory negotiation I was preparing to use offensively. He looked at the desk surface. He inverted it. 4 months, she said. The timing aligns with when the Marchetti intelligence about you first appeared in our network. He looked up at her. I assumed the leak was external, a surveillance operation, intercepted communication. I was wrong. She absorbed that. He fed them the information about me. He identified you as the most viable pressure point and gave them the mechanism to use it. Valentino's voice was very even, the evenness of a container under pressure. Which means the dinner, Ethan Cross, the ambush on the lakefront road, all of it was built on Quinn's intelligence. The room shifted around her in the way that rooms shifted when the architecture of a situation revealed itself to be different from what you'd understood it to be. Not the walls moving, the understanding moving. The realization that the last 36 hours, which she had experienced as a series of external events happening to her, had been engineered. Not by random malice, by someone sitting 2 floors above them right now in his office, patient and organized and absolutely convinced of his own correctness. He's going to know, she said. When the car comes at 11 and I'm not at the service entrance, he's going to know it went wrong. Yes. What does he do then? Valentino stood. That's what the next 15 minutes are for. At 10:53, the east service entrance was exactly as Quinn had promised. Unlocked, the security rotation gap exactly where he'd said it would be. She stood just inside the door with Valentino 2 feet behind her in the darkness of the service corridor and listened to the October wind against the outer walls and waited. At 10:58, a car pulled to the service entrance. Black. No plates visible. Its headlights cut off 20 feet before it stopped. At 10:59, Valentino's hand found her shoulder in the dark. Not pulling her back, just present. At 11, the door from the interior of the house opened behind them and Gareth Quinn walked through it. He was wearing his jacket again. His glass was gone. He stopped when he saw them both standing at the service entrance, and for one complete second, the longest second she'd counted in recent memory, his face showed her exactly what was underneath the patience and the controlled projection and the 11 years of organizational loyalty deployed as a weapon. It was not guilt. It was not fear. It was the expression of a man who had calculated everything correctly and was only now discovering that the calculation had contained an assumption he hadn't examined, the assumption that she was a variable and not a participant. Gareth, Valentino said quietly. Quinn looked at him, then at her. Then at the door behind them where, she understood without turning, 3 of Valentino's most trusted people were standing in the dark. You told him, Quinn said, not accusatory, almost wondering. Yes, she said. I gave you an exit. You gave me a cage with a different door. Quinn looked at Valentino. Something passed between them. The compressed residue of 11 years, the specific grief of a betrayal that moved in both directions at once. Because the man who had been betrayed had also, in Quinn's accounting, committed the first betrayal by becoming someone other than who Quinn had needed him to remain. You were going to get her killed, Quinn said. Eventually, you know that. That's not your decision, Valentino said. Someone had to make it. Not you. The quietness of Valentino's voice was the most controlled thing she'd heard in 2 days of controlled things. Never you. Quinn looked at the floor. 1 breath, 2. Then he raised his eyes to Valentino's with an expression that was the closest thing to naked she'd seen on a human face in a long time. Stripped of calculation, stripped of patience, containing only the raw and terrible conviction of a man who had done a wrong thing for reasons he still believed were right. Outside, the black car waited. Inside the service corridor, the 11 years between them broke along the fault line she had revealed. And Talia Mercer stood in the dark between the man who had tried to trade her and the man who had refused the trade, and felt something harden in her chest that had never been hard before. Not anger, not fear, but something colder and more permanent than either, something that understood now with complete and unsentimental clarity that she was not going to survive what was coming next by being the woman who needed to be protected from it. She was going to survive it by becoming the woman who finished things. The thought completed itself in the same moment Valentino's people moved out of the dark behind Quinn, and the service corridor became a different kind of space, contained, controlled, the geometry of it rearranged by the presence of 3 men who knew exactly what their positions meant, and had taken them without being told twice. Quinn did not fight it. That was the thing she would remember later. Not his resistance, but his absence of it, the way he stood with his hands visible and his jaw set, while 2 of Valentino's men secured him, wearing the expression of a man who had known this was one of the possible outcomes and had decided some time ago that he could live with it. Whether that was courage or the particular arrogance of someone who had never genuinely believed he could be wrong, she couldn't determine. Maybe there was no difference. The black car outside idled for 4 more minutes. Then its engine note changed and it pulled away into the October dark, unhurried, as though it had simply been waiting for something that had not materialized and had decided without drama to go wait somewhere else. Which meant the Marchetti people in that car were already calling someone, already reporting, already setting in motion whatever the contingency was for a failed handoff. Valentino watched the car's taillights disappear and then turned and looked at her with an expression that contained, for the first time since she'd met him, something openly unguarded. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the operational layer reasserted itself, but she caught it and held it and understood what it meant. How long before they move? She asked. Hours, he said. Not days. He was right. It took 4. They spent those 4 hours in a state of controlled preparation that she found, to her own surprise, clarifying rather than terrifying. The house transformed around her. Not dramatically, not with the theater of action movies she'd absorbed over a lifetime of ordinary existence, but efficiently. The way a skilled team transformed a space when they knew what they were doing and had done versions of it before. Furniture moved. Sightlines were assessed. People took positions and checked equipment with the quiet focus of individuals who had learned that noise and urgency and preparation were liabilities rather than signals of seriousness. Valentino brought her into every conversation, not as a courtesy, as a participant. He showed her the estate's layout on a tablet, the security positions, the choke points. He told her where she would be and why that location rather than another. He gave her information instead of instructions, and the distinction mattered more than she could have articulated at the time. Quinn was secured in the basement level, 2 men with him. The conversation Valentino needed to have with him about the full depth of what he'd told the Marchetti organization would happen when the night was over, and not before, because Valentino was not a man who allowed personal injury to consume tactical bandwidth, when tactical bandwidth was what stood between the people in his house and catastrophic harm. She understood that about him now. Understood it and recognized it as the thing that made him what he was. Not the authority, not the controlled projection, not the scar or the silence or the particular quality of stillness he carried. The ability to hold the personal and the operational in separate hands and use each one correctly. At 3 in the morning, Mrs. Carver appeared in the kitchen with coffee and sandwiches and the expression of a woman who had survived previous versions of this night and had developed opinions about nutrition under stress. Nobody argued with her. Talia ate a sandwich she barely tasted and drank coffee that was too strong and watched Valentino move through the kitchen, checking in with each of his people in turn. Not hovering, not micromanaging, just present in a way that communicated to each person that he knew exactly where they were and what they were doing and considered both worth his attention. At 3:47, the perimeter alert went off. Not an alarm, a change in the quality of the house's ambient sound, subtle enough that she wouldn't have caught it 2 days ago and caught it now only because she'd been listening for it. Valentino was already moving before the report came through his earpiece. He came to her first. "East tree line," he said. "Multiple entry points. They're not trying to be quiet, which means they have numbers and they want us to know it. Intimidation before engagement." "Yes." His hand came to her face, one brief contact, the side of her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone. Not tender exactly, but entirely direct. The gesture of a man saying something he didn't have the seconds to say in words. Then it was gone, and he was moving. "Library," he said over his shoulder. "Stay in the library until I come for you." She went to the library. The library was at the center of the ground floor, Bess. No exterior windows, maximum structural walls between it and any entry point. The single interior room in the house that had been built, she now understood, with exactly this kind of situation in mind. She went in and closed the door and stood in the dark for approximately 30 seconds before she turned on the single lamp on the reading desk and looked at the room properly. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, rolling ladder on a brass rail. The reading desk, solid oak, heavy. A fireplace on the 4th wall, unlit. And along the bottom shelf to her left, partially behind the ladder's base, the thing her eyes found with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 6 years working with chemicals and knew what their containers looked like from across a room. A restoration kit. Small, leather-bound, the kind of portable kit that serious collectors kept near their most valued pieces for emergency stabilization. She'd seen 100 of them. She crossed to it and opened it and looked at what was inside with the focused inventory of a professional. Solvent. Consolidant. 2 sizes of brush. Cotton swabs. A small glass bottle of acetone. A larger bottle of isopropyl with a spray nozzle. Rubber gloves in a sealed packet. She looked at the door. She looked at the room. She did the particular calculation that was available to her. Not a combat calculation. She was not that, and had no pretensions toward being it, but a conservator's calculation. The assessment of what materials were available and what they could be made to do in conditions they had not been designed for. She put on the rubber gloves. Outside the library's walls, the house had become a different place. She could hear it. Not the specific sounds of what was happening. The walls were too solid for that. But the vibration of it, the structural transmission of motion and impact, and the occasional sharp report of things that were not furniture falling. She focused on the sounds with the same deliberate attention she brought to damaged paintings. Not to understand them emotionally, but to read them, extract information, determine what they meant about the state of things beyond what she could see. The shooting was sporadic and then stopped. The motion continued. Then the door handle moved. She had 6 seconds between the handle moving and the door opening, and she used all 6. She picked up the acetone bottle in her right hand and positioned herself against the wall beside the fireplace, not behind the desk, which was the obvious position and the first place a trained person would look. And she breathed, 2 full breaths. And she was not calm, but she was present, which was the thing that mattered, and which she had, she realized, been in training for without knowing it every time she'd stood in front of a damaged thing and refused to let the damage be the only story. The door opened. It was not Valentino. Gareth Quinn had not, it turned out, been as secured as 2 men in a basement level were supposed to make a person. He came through the library door wearing the evidence of how he'd gotten here. A split above his eyebrow, his shirt torn at the collar, moving with the specific controlled urgency of a man in pain who had decided the pain was not the point. In his right hand, he held a pistol. In his left, nothing, the hand slightly open, and she noticed the left hand because the left hand told her something. The right hand's weapon didn't. He wasn't entirely sure yet what he was going to do. He saw her immediately. She'd made no attempt to hide. Hiding in a room with one exit was a losing proposition. And she'd been to enough emergency stabilization situations to know that the worst thing you could do with a compromised structure was pretend the compromise wasn't there. "Where's Valentino?" he said. "I don't know." "Don't." He moved into the room, not toward her but to a position that gave him the door and her in the same sightline. Professional habit, even now. "Where is he?" "I genuinely don't know. He told me to come here." Quinn looked at her with the exhausted, burning focus of a man whose plan had gone wrong in sequence and was now operating in the territory past the plan, where improvisation was the only available mode. The split above his eyebrow was bleeding in a slow, steady line down the side of his face that he wasn't bothering to address. "The Marchetti people," he said. "How many got through?" "I don't know that either." "You've been in here the whole time." "Yes." He absorbed that. His eyes moved around the library. The desk, the shelves, the fireplace, the lamp. With the inventory assessment of someone looking for tactical information, or possibly looking for a moment that wasn't this one, a version of the last 4 months that had resolved differently. "Put down the bottle," he said, looking at her right hand. She looked at the acetone in her grip. "No." His jaw tightened. "Talia, you don't get to use my name," she said. "You lost that when you stood in the studio and told me you'd arranged for me to be taken." She kept her voice even, kept her body still. The acetone bottle was cool through the rubber glove. "What do you want, Gareth? Really? Not the organizational justification, not the Sonia story. What do you actually want right now, in this room?" The question landed differently than she'd expected it to. She'd expected him to deflect or advance. Instead, he stopped moving. His gun hand didn't lower, but it didn't rise either. He just stopped. And in the stopping, she saw something she hadn't expected. A man who had been moving at speed toward a destination for 4 months and had arrived somewhere he didn't recognize. "I wanted it to be over," he said. And the simplicity of it, the exhausted, stripped-down honesty of it, was more unsettling than anything calculated would have been. "I wanted the war to be over and Valentino to be intact and the organization to survive. That's what I wanted. And me. You were the price." He said it without cruelty, and somehow that was worse. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you decided my life was a currency you had the right to spend." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "I did." "And now?" He looked at her steadily. The blood from his eyebrow had reached his jaw. "Now Marchetti's people are in this house, and Valentino is somewhere in it, and I don't know if the play I made tonight got him killed or not." His voice, for the first time since she'd met him, had lost its projection. It was just a voice now. Tired and uncertain and genuinely frightened, not for himself, she could read the distinction, but for the man he'd spent 11 years working beside and had spent 4 months betraying for reasons he still, she could see, believed were sound. "I need to know if he's alive." "Put the gun down," she said. "I can't do that." "Then we're going to stay here in this room until someone comes through that door and tells us. And whether that someone is Valentino or a Marchetti soldier is going to determine what happens to both of us." She held his gaze. "Put it down, Gareth." The seconds between that sentence and what followed were the longest seconds she'd spent in a room that wasn't moving. The gun came down. Not dropped, lowered, deliberately, placed on the corner of the oak desk with the controlled care of a man disarming himself as an act of will rather than defeat. Quinn straightened and looked at her and breathed through whatever the act had cost him. Then the door came off its hinges. Not opened, removed, violently, the frame splintering inward as something struck it from the other side with the full force of someone who had stopped caring about the structural integrity of interior doors. The lamp on the reading desk swayed. Talia's back hit the shelving behind her, and she brought the acetone bottle up on pure instinct and then stopped. Valentino came through the doorway. He was not intact. His jacket was gone. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder and dark with something she identified as blood before she identified it as his, and the sequence of those 2 recognitions hit her at different depths. His face had the specific focused blankness of a man still operating on the other side of an adrenaline peak. The world narrowed to the information immediately in front of him. He took in the room in one sweep. Her, the shelving, the acetone in her gloved hand, Quinn at the desk, hands visible, the gun beside him. His eyes came to rest on Quinn. "Valentino," Quinn's voice was level, a last effort at levelness. The Marchetti people. How many? Finished, Valentino said. One word. The architecture of the night compressed into it. Quinn closed his eyes. One breath. When he opened them, the calculation was gone from his face entirely. And you? I'm standing, Valentino said. Then he crossed the room in 4 strides and hit Quinn with the full weight of everything that had accumulated in the last 4 months and the last 4 hours combined. And Quinn went back against the desk and took it without raising his hands, and the sound of it was brutal and final. And the desk held, and Quinn didn't fall. And Valentino stepped back with his right hand at his side and blood on his knuckles that was not entirely his own. Quinn straightened. His lip was split now to match the eyebrow. He looked at Valentino with the unguarded expression she'd been seeing in pieces all night, the full version of it, the grief and the conviction and the exhaustion of a man who had done an unforgivable thing and understood its full dimensions and could not make himself believe he'd been wrong to do it. I was trying to protect you, Quinn said. I know, Valentino said. From her. I know what you thought. Valentino's voice was the quietest she'd heard it. You were wrong. Quinn looked at her, the blood on his face, the gloved hand with the acetone bottle, the shelving at her back. Something in his expression shifted. The last calculation he was capable of in this room, she thought, on this night. And then it settled into something that was not quite acceptance and not quite defeat, but held the shape of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. She lowered the acetone bottle. Valentino's men came through the doorway behind him, 2 of them, moving with the post-action efficiency of people with work left to complete. They took Quinn without dramatics, and Quinn went without resistance, and then they were gone. And the library was quiet, and it was just the 2 of them and the broken door and the lamp still swaying on the reading desk. Valentino turned to her. She looked at him. Really looked. The way she looked at paintings that had sustained damage and needed to be assessed honestly before anything else could happen. The shoulder wound was real. Not catastrophic, she thought, but serious enough that it would need attention before the adrenaline fully metabolized and his body started sending him accurate signals about it. His hands were steady, his breathing was elevated but decelerating. His eyes were on her with the focused intensity of a man doing the same assessment she was doing and arriving, by the look of it, at conclusions that were not entirely clinical. You stayed in the library, he said. You told me to stay in the library. I didn't expect you to actually... He stopped. You were going to use the acetone. If I needed to. He looked at the bottle in her gloved hand. On Quinn. On whoever came through the door. She set the bottle down on the desk beside where the gun had been, pulled off the rubber gloves and set them down too. He got here first. And you talked him into putting down his weapon. He talked himself into it. I just asked the right question. Valentino looked at her for a moment that extended past the tactical into something else. The sway of the lamp was slowing. Outside the estate, the October wind had picked up, and she could hear it against the walls of the house, indifferent and continuous, the sound of a world that had not paused for any of this. Your shoulder, she said. It can wait. It can wait 10 minutes. After that, it shouldn't. She moved toward him. He held still in the way of people who had learned that staying still while injured was the appropriate response, and had also, she suspected, no particular practice with allowing people to approach them with concern rather than deference. She looked at the shoulder, the torn shirt, the dark stain, the edges of the wound visible below the fabric. I need more light and something to work with. There's a medical kit in the kitchen. Then let's go to the kitchen. He didn't move immediately. Looked at her with the expression she was starting to be able to read, the one that appeared when something had happened that he was filing away to examine later, when the operational requirements of the present moment allowed for the luxury of examination. Quinn told you about Sonia, he said. Yes? And you came and told me anyway. Yes? Why? She looked at him steadily. Because the story he told me about her was designed to make me see myself as a repetition, a pattern. Another woman who is going to compromise you and cost people their lives. She paused. And I am not a repetition of anything. Something moved through his face at that. The brief, unguarded thing, and this time it stayed longer than 2 seconds. No, he said quietly. You're not. Outside the broken library door, the house was beginning the work of returning to itself. Voices low and purposeful, the sound of order being restored from the aftermath of violence, the particular industry of people who had been through bad things before and knew the protocol for the morning after. Mrs. Carver's footsteps moved somewhere above them with their characteristic unhurried authority. The Marchetti operation had come to the DeLuca estate and had not left the way it had arrived. That was the fact of the night, and it was a significant fact, and Valentino understood its implications. The conversations that would follow, the power vacuums, the realignment of every relationship in the organizational landscape that the night's outcome made necessary. All of that was the next days, the next weeks. Right now there was the kitchen and the medical kit and the shoulder wound that was not going to take care of itself, and the woman who had spent 2 days being the person this was happening to and had become, somewhere in the last 4 hours, the person shaping what happened next. She walked out of the library. After a moment, he followed. They were halfway down the main hall when his phone went off. He looked at the screen, stopped walking. She stopped too and watched his face go through something she hadn't seen on it. Not alarm, not the controlled processing of threat assessment, but something slower and more personal. He read the message twice. Then he looked up at her with an expression that told her, before he said a single word, that the night was not over. That the thing she'd thought was the end was in fact the message on Valentino's phone contained 4 words and a location. He's alive. The docks. She read it over his shoulder because he turned the phone toward her without being asked, which told her something about how much had changed in the 72 hours since a stranger had sat down at her table in an emerald-lit restaurant and rearranged the geography of her life. The 4 words and the location sat on the screen between them in the half-dark of the main hallway, and she understood immediately, from the quality of his stillness, that this was not good news wearing the costume of good news. "Who?" she said. "Marco Marchetti." Put the phone in his pocket. The organization's actual head, not the intermediaries, not the operational people who came here tonight. He looked at her. Marco himself. He's at the docks. He's been at the docks, waiting to see how tonight resolved before deciding his next move. His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with the shoulder wound. He reached out through a channel that means he wants a conversation rather than another engagement. Or it means he wants you at a location of his choosing when you're injured and your people are depleted. Yes, he said. It could mean that. She looked at him steadily. You're going. I have to go. Your shoulder, it needs 20 minutes. He was already moving toward the kitchen. Come with me. The medical kit was under the kitchen island in a locked case that Mrs. Carver produced with the expression of a woman who had produced it before and had feelings about the frequency. She set it on the island's surface and looked at Valentino's shoulder, and then at Talia, and then left without commentary, which was its own form of commentary. Talia opened the case. The contents were serious. Not a first aid kit, a medical kit. The difference being the difference between what you needed for a scraped knee and what you needed for a gunshot wound that had passed through the meat of the shoulder without hitting anything structural. She'd assessed that much in the library. The wound was real and ugly and would need proper treatment when proper treatment was available, but it was not the kind of wound that stopped a man like this from doing what he'd decided to do. She cleaned it with what was available. He sat on a kitchen stool with his torn shirt off and his jaw set and did not make a sound during any of it, which she found neither impressive nor surprising. It was simply consistent with everything else she had observed about how he inhabited pain, which was to acknowledge it privately and refuse to let it run the room. Tell me about Marco Marchetti, she said while she worked. He told her. The patriarch. 71 years old, which was an age that men in his position rarely reached, which meant he had navigated 4 decades of the particular ecosystem he operated in with a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that outlasted the people who had come at him with one but not the other. The war with the DeLuca organization was not personal in origin. It was territorial, economic, the kind of conflict that started over distribution rights and real estate and had accumulated personal weight over years until the original cause was almost beside the point. Marco Marchetti had 2 sons, both dead, which was the biographical detail that explained more about him than anything else. The shape of a man who had outlived the things he'd built toward and was now operating in the strange, unmoored territory past his own original purpose. He reached out, she said. That matters. It matters, or it's calculated to look like it matters. Why would he reach out instead of regrouping and coming again? Valentino was quiet for a moment. She taped the dressing in place and stepped back, and he rolled his shoulder once, carefully, assessing the functional limitation. Because tonight cost him, he said. The people he sent were not replaceable assets, and because... He paused. Marco Marchetti is 71 years old and his sons are dead, and he has been in this war for 3 years, and whatever he thought it was going to give him, it hasn't given him. She looked at him. You understand that about him. I understand it because I've been watching it happen. He picked up his phone from the island. And because I know what it looks like to be a man who is still fighting for something that is already finished. She heard the thing underneath that sentence, heard it and did not reach for it, because it was not the moment and he was not a man who would thank her for reaching for it in the wrong moment. Instead, she said, I'm coming with you. He looked at her. Not as a liability, she said, not as something you have to manage. I'm coming because Marco Marchetti came here through a human channel, his own reach, his own decision. And that means what happens at those docks tonight is as much about what people are willing to stop doing as it is about who has more capacity for violence. And that conversation is one I can be useful in. You don't know that. I know that you've been speaking to these people in one language for 3 years, she said. And I know that you're going to walk into that conversation with a shoulder wound and depleted people and the weight of what Quinn did sitting on you and the accumulated toll of 3 years of this specific war. And I know that Marco Marchetti is going to read all of that and use it. She held his gaze. Take me. Let me be in the room. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she heard the house around them. Mrs. Carver, somewhere in the upper floors, the security staff in the outer rooms, the October wind against the walls, long enough that she understood he was not deciding whether she was capable. He had already decided that. He was deciding something else, something more complicated, something that had to do with what it meant to let another person stand beside you in the place where you were most exposed. Stay close, he said. Don't speak unless I've indicated. And if it goes wrong, you move toward the water and you do not stop. Understood. I mean it, Talia. I know you mean it. They left for the docks at 4:30 in the morning. The Chicago waterfront at that hour was a particular kind of empty. Not the empty of a place that had been vacated, but the empty of a place that had never been meant for ordinary occupation. Its geography designed for cargo and commerce and the movement of large things by night. The dock structures rose against a sky that was beginning to consider the question of dawn without committing to it, the lake beyond them black and wide and completely indifferent. 2 vehicles, 4 of Valentino's people, and Talia in the rear seat of the lead car with her hands flat on her thighs, the way she'd learned to hold them when they wanted to do something that would not be useful. The Marchetti presence was visible from 100 yards. 3 cars arranged in a loose triangle around the entrance to a specific dock structure, the positioning simultaneously defensive and open, the body language of armed people who had been told to look like they were not preparing for violence, even though preparation for violence was the only mode available to them at this hour in this place. A man stood in front of the cars, old, heavy through the shoulders in the way of men who had been physically formidable in their youth and carried the remnant of it into age. Gray-white hair, a coat that was too light for the October wind off the lake, which he appeared not to notice. Marco Marchetti. He was alone in front of his cars in a way that required either complete confidence in his own security or a level of exhaustion with self-preservation that had moved past the point of fear. Looking at him as Valentino's car stopped and the door opened, she thought it was probably the second thing. Valentino got out. She got out on the other side, which was not what he'd arranged, but he didn't stop her. His people arranged themselves with the economy of a team that trusted each other's positioning and didn't need to be directed through it. Marco Marchetti looked at Valentino across the space between the cars. Then his eyes moved to her, briefly, with the assessment of a man who had spent 7 decades reading rooms, and then back to Valentino. You brought her, he said. His voice was heavily accented, roughened by decades of something, cigarettes or grief, or the specific abrasion of the life he'd chosen, probably some compound of all 3. Interesting choice. She wanted to come, Valentino said. Women who want to come to conversations like this one. Marco's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. My wife was like that. She said I never listened to anyone who didn't already agree with me. He looked out at the lake for a moment. She was right. The wind came off the water and moved through the space between them, and the dock structures groaned against it with the sound of old wood making its accommodation with force. You sent 11 people to my house tonight, Valentino said. I sent 11 people to finish a war, Marco said. There's a difference. 4 of them are dead. Yes. Marco looked at him without flinching. I know the Count. And you're here. I'm here because the Count tells me something I should have understood 3 years ago. He moved, not toward Valentino, just a shift of weight, the physical adjustment of a large old man who had been standing in Lake Wind for too long. That this particular war doesn't have an ending that leaves anyone standing who I want to leave standing. Valentino said nothing. He was doing what he did, giving silence the space to be filled by whoever needed to fill it. Your man Quinn came to us 4 months ago, Marco said. You know this now, I think. I know. He said he could give us the woman. He said it would end your capacity for offensive action, that without her, without the distraction of her, you would be reasonable. Marco paused. I agreed because I was tired, and because he was persuasive, and because... He stopped. Looked at Talia for a moment with an expression she hadn't expected, something too complicated to name but containing, she thought, something close to apology. Because it was easier to believe what he told me than to find another path. And now, Valentino said, now 4 more of my people are dead, and I'm standing on a dock at 4 in the morning talking to you instead of sleeping, which I have not done properly in 3 years. Marco Marchetti looked at Valentino De Luca with the specific tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long that he had forgotten what his body felt like without the weight. My sons are dead. Both of them. You know that. Yes. The oldest died in a conflict that had nothing to do with De Luca. The younger one... He paused, and in the pause she heard the enormous thing that lived in it. The younger one died in the 2nd year of this. In a way I ordered, because I believed he had become a liability. He said it flatly, the way people said things they had said to themselves many times in private and had decided to stop protecting. I was right about the liability. That doesn't change what I did. The dock groaned. The lake moved against the pilings with its constant, patient percussion. What do you want, Marco? Valentino asked. The old man looked at him. I want it to stop, said simply, without theater, the sentence of a man who had run out of everything that wasn't the truth. I want territorial lines that hold. I want written terms that my people can operate within without the constant overhead of a war neither side can afford to finish. I want to be able to sleep. He looked briefly at the lake. I'm 71 years old. I have no sons. I have an organization that will outlast me by perhaps a decade if I manage it well, and by perhaps 2 years if I don't. He looked back. I would like to manage it well. Talia watched Valentino receive that, watched him process it with the careful attention of a man who had been deceived before and knew the architecture of deception from the inside and was now examining this offering for the places where the structure might be false. She could see him doing it. She could see, too, the moment when he found what he was looking for, not the falseness, but the absence of it. The recognition that the man in front of him was not performing exhaustion. He was exhausted. Quinn, Valentino said. He approached you. Yes. And you used him. Yes. You fed intelligence back through him. You let him believe the arrangement was his. Marco's expression shifted slightly. He was useful, and he believed in what he was doing, which made him more useful than someone who was simply bought. He paused. That's not a justification. It's an accounting. Valentino looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, terms. One word. An opening. What followed was 90 minutes of conversation that she had no frame for from her previous life. The specific language of men negotiating the boundaries of territories that existed in the invisible architecture of a city's underworld, the currency of obligation and precedent, and the agreed-upon fictions that allowed organized violence to become, under certain conditions, organized peace. She stood and listened and watched and said nothing, because this was not her language, and she had enough respect for the complexity of it not to pretend otherwise. But she watched Marco Marchetti watch Valentino, and she watched the old man's face as the conversation moved, the incremental release of something that had been held under pressure for 3 years, visible in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his pauses. She thought about what he'd said about his wife, about listening to people who didn't already agree with him. At 20 minutes before 6, when the sky had committed to the idea of dawn and the lake had turned from black to a deep and particular gray, the terms were set. Not signed. The documentation would come later, through lawyers who served people like this and maintained their own careful fictions about the nature of their clients, but spoken and witnessed and sealed with the specific weight that spoken agreements carried in a world where breaking them had consequences that paperwork didn't. Marco Marchetti shook Valentino's hand. Then he looked at Talia. "You came," he said, "to this." He gestured at the docks, the water, the whole improbable geography of 4:30 in the morning on the Chicago waterfront. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because it mattered." He looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression she'd caught before. "Quinn told me about you," he said. "He described you as a vulnerability, as something to be managed or removed." He paused. "I should have asked what kind of man describes a woman like that, and what that description tells you about him." She held his gaze. "It tells you he was afraid." "Yes." Marco looked at her steadily. Of her, or of what she made him feel, or of what she made the man he worked for feel. It doesn't matter which. Fear makes people into instruments. He pulled his coat tighter against the wind. "You didn't run." "No, that's rarer than people think." He nodded once, not a bow, not a gesture of deference, just the acknowledgement of one person who had looked clearly at another and found what they found. Then he turned and walked back to his cars, and his people closed around him, and the Marchetti vehicles moved out along the dock road and disappeared into the pre-dawn gray. The silence they left behind was the most complete silence she'd experienced in days. Valentino stood beside her, and they both looked at the lake for a moment, the gray water moving in its steady, purposeless way, the horizon beginning to separate itself from the sky in a thin line of lighter gray. "It'll hold," he said. Not a question. "You believe that?" "I believe he's tired enough to mean it." He paused. "Which is sometimes the only thing that makes peace possible. Not virtue, just exhaustion." She looked at him, at the profile of him in the early light, the scar along his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that she had read as coldness in the restaurant 3 days ago, and understood now as something entirely different, something that was what remained when a person had been tested to their specific limits enough times that panic was simply no longer available to them. "Your shoulder," she said. "Hospital," he agreed. "Now." They walked back to the car. His hand found the small of her back. Briefly, a point of contact rather than a grip, the gesture of a man who had learned to communicate what mattered through touch rather than declaration, because declaration had too much theater in it and touch did not lie. She let it be there. 6 weeks passed. The DeLuca estate was quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of threat. The threat had not vanished. Threats in the world Valentino inhabited did not vanish. They transformed. They receded to manageable distances. They became the background noise of a life rather than its immediate foreground. The Marchetti terms held. The territorial lines were documented and observed. The war, which had consumed 3 years and more lives than she'd been given the full count of, became past tense. Quinn was dealt with in ways she was not given the specifics of and did not ask for. She understood that the conversation between Valentino and the man who had served him for 11 years had happened and had been what it needed to be, and that whatever its outcome, Valentino had come back from it carrying something new in his face. Not heavier exactly, but more settled. The way wounds settled when they were properly treated rather than ignored. The shoulder healed. She watched it heal with the particular attention of someone who had cleaned and dressed it in a kitchen at 4 in the morning and had a vested interest in the outcome. The studio on the North Shore became hers in a way that had not been formally arranged, but had simply developed, the way things developed in houses when people stopped being guests and became something the house incorporated. South-facing light. The work table. The shelves she stocked herself with the materials she brought from her studio on Wabash. 2 trips in Valentino's car with the driver who had learned to make himself invisible while somehow being completely reliable. She was working on a painting when he came to find her on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the docks. Not a restoration, her own work. Something she'd started without entirely planning to start. The canvas emerging from sessions that began as occupying time and became something else. She heard him in the doorway and kept working, because she was at a point in the underpainting that required her full attention, and he had learned in 6 weeks of living in the same house as a conservator that interrupting the underpainting was not something you did. He waited. When she stepped back and set down the brush, he said, "Ethan Cross." She turned. "What about him?" "He's been cooperative." Valentino leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed, and the afternoon light from the south windows falling across him at the angle that she'd noticed changed his face, softened the scar, put warmth into the gray-green eyes. "The gambling debt is cleared. The men he was working with are being managed. He's been informed that his usefulness to anyone with connections to our world is permanently at an end." Meaning the next time he sits across a restaurant table from a woman, he'll do it without a hidden agenda. A pause. "And with considerably more respect." She looked at him. "Did you have someone explain that to him?" "Personally." She picked up her brush again, then put it back down. "And the restaurant," she said. "Aurelius." Something shifted in his expression. "What about it?" "The DeLuca Foundation's annual dinner. You hold it there. Every year, December." "I want to go." He looked at her steadily. "That's 6 weeks from now." "I know when December is, Valentino." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the expression she'd catalogued early and returned to frequently. The one that appeared when she said something that surprised him into something close to amusement. The rare and slightly reluctant evidence that beneath the controlled surface there was a man who found things genuinely funny and had perhaps forgotten that for a while. "Yes," he said. "You can go." "We can go." "Yes." He looked at the canvas behind her. "What are you painting?" She turned to look at it with him. The underpainting in its current state, the composition still mostly structural, the image emerging from it in the way images emerged from underpaintings, which was not all at once but gradually, the way things revealed themselves when you were patient enough and looking in the right direction. A woman, standing not quite in the center of the frame, looking out of the canvas at something the viewer couldn't see, with an expression that was not fear and not triumph, but the specific quality of a person who has survived something and is in the process of deciding what to do with the survival. "I don't know yet," she said. "She's still becoming herself." He looked at the canvas for a moment, then at her. "I know the feeling," he said quietly. She picked up the brush. The December dinner at Aurelius was everything that the October dinner had not been. She wore a different dress. Deep burgundy, not emerald, the choice deliberate, because she was not returning to who she had been on that night, but arriving somewhere new, and she wanted the color to acknowledge that. Her hair the way she wanted it, her shoulders occupying the space they occupied, which was their space, which she had stopped negotiating about with herself sometime in the last 6 weeks, in a shift so gradual she hadn't noticed it happening until it was simply the fact of her. The restaurant recognized her. Not the staff, the room itself, the specific chandeliers and marble and amber light, the geometry of it lodged in her memory with the particular clarity of places where significant things had happened. She walked through the door and felt the memory of the last time she'd walked through this door, the hope of it, the subsequent wreckage of it. And then she let it be a memory rather than a wound, which was the thing you learned to do when wounds had been given sufficient time and sufficient honesty to become just part of the history. Table 14 was not their table. Valentino had a different arrangement entirely. A large table near the room's center, because the DeLuca Foundation dinner was not a private meal but a gathering, and the gathering was substantial. Artists, scholars, women who ran nonprofits that the foundation supported, civic figures who moved through the city's visible architecture in ways that occasionally intersected with Valentino's invisible one. A room full of people doing the work of building things rather than defending them. She moved through it at Valentino's side and met people who knew his name and some who knew hers and some who knew neither and needed to be introduced to both. And she was present for all of it in a way that was simply herself, not performing confidence, not managing her space, not calculating what version of herself was appropriate for this particular audience. just present, taking up the space she took up, which turned out to be the right amount. At some point in the evening, she looked across the room and found, at a table near the far wall, a young woman eating alone. Mid-20s, perhaps. Dressed carefully in the way of someone who had dressed carefully for an occasion they found slightly overwhelming and was working to conceal it. There was something in her posture, a slight inward quality, a careful smallness, that Talia recognized in the way you recognize things you had once been. She crossed the room, sat down in the empty chair across from the woman without being invited, which was not something she would have done 3 months ago and did now without thinking about it. "I'm Talia," she said. "Are you here with the foundation?" The woman looked up with the expression of someone who had not expected to be approached. "I received a grant," she said, "for my restoration work. I wasn't sure I was supposed to be at this table. Actually, I think I may have—" "You're supposed to be exactly where you are," Talia said. The woman looked at her. Something shifted in her face, the careful smallness relaxing slightly, making room for something else. They talked for 40 minutes, about restoration work, about the specific challenges of water-damaged canvas, about the grant program, and what the foundation was building and where the young woman's work was going. Talia gave her 3 contacts and 1 piece of advice that she delivered without preamble. Stop making yourself smaller than you are in professional settings. The work is good. Let it be good out loud. The woman looked at her. "How do you do that? Just say that." "Practice," Talia said. "And the understanding that the alternative is worse." She paused. "Also, someone said something to me once at a table in this restaurant, and I've been paying it forward ever since." Later, near the evening's end, Valentino found her near the windows that looked out across the city. He came to stand beside her without comment. The two of them looking out at Chicago, doing what Chicago did, performing itself, enormous and indifferent, and lit up against a December sky. "You were with the Ferrara grant recipient for a long time," he said. "She's talented. She needed someone to tell her." He looked at her profile. "And how are you?" She considered the question properly because he asked it properly, not as a pleasantry but as a real question, the kind that came from someone who had been paying attention and wanted an honest answer. "I'm different," she said, "than I was when I walked into this room 3 months ago." "Different how?" She thought about the canvas in the studio, the woman emerging from the underpainting, the quality of her expression. "Less apologetic," she said finally, "about existing." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Good." She turned to look at him. This close, in the amber light of Aurelius, she could see the scar along his jaw and the gray-green eyes and the specific way he looked at her, which was the way he had looked at her from the beginning. She understood now, with the full attention of a man who had decided this was worth attending to completely and had never revised that decision. "You've never asked me to be anything different," she said. "Why would I?" "Most people do. Eventually. Most people," he said, "are afraid of the thing they're actually in the presence of." He held her gaze. "I am not most people." "No," she agreed, "you're not." The room moved around them. The conversation, the music, the particular warmth of a gathered group of people doing the work of something good. The restaurant that had witnessed her humiliation in October witnessed something different in December. And the difference was not in the room or the light or the marble floors. The difference was in the woman standing at the window, who had walked into this building 3 months ago hoping to be seen, and had walked out of it changed, and had become, through everything that followed, someone who no longer required the specific validation of being seen by others because she had, at some point in the last 90 days, learned to be seen clearly by herself. She picked up her glass from the windowsill. Valentino picked up his. Outside, Chicago ran on in its enormous, comprehensive way. The lake at its eastern edge, the city at its heart. The invisible architecture of power and consequence threading through it all beneath the surface of ordinary life. In the spring, there would be new territory to navigate, new complications in the organizational landscape, the ongoing work of a peace that required maintenance rather than declaration. There would be mornings in the studio with the south-facing light and evenings in a house that had stopped being unfamiliar. There would be the DeLuca Foundation expanding its work into areas that had not yet been identified, and a young restorer named Ferrara who would go on to do exceptional things. There would be a painting completed in February that Valentino would ask to keep, and which she would allow him to keep, because the woman in it had finally finished becoming herself and deserved to be somewhere she was properly seen. None of that was tonight. Tonight was the room and the light and the quiet understanding between two people who had been tested in the specific way that revealed what a person actually was beneath the versions of themselves they had learned to present to the world and had found in each other something that held. She raised her glass slightly. He touched his to it without ceremony, the small, untheatrical gesture of someone who meant it. The city ran on outside the windows. The enemies were gone. The war was finished. And Talia Mercer stood in the room that had tried to diminish her and occupied every inch of herself, without apology, without negotiation, without the particular exhausting effort of smallness, beside the only person who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly, completely, and unapologetically what she was. Fade out.